Picture this, the year is 1814, Spain is exhausted. Its people have endured invasion, betrayal, and war. Cities lie in ruins, families are shattered, and the nation is desperate for stability, desperate for hope. And into this fragile silence rides a man draped in royal silk, his face marked with arrogance, his eyes burning with the hunger of absolute power. This man is Ferdinand VII, but to his subjects he would come to be known by another name: the worst king in Spanish history. Why? Because behind the crown, behind the royal ceremonies and processions, hid a tyrant whose cruelty, paranoia, and lust for control destroyed not only Spain's future, but also the lives of millions. He wasn't just incompetent, he wasn't just selfish, he was depraved, and tonight we're going to peel back the golden facade of monarchy and step into the shadows of Ferdinand's reign. We'll expose the betrayals, the scandals, and the chilling truth of how one man's greed could devastate an entire empire. But here's the question you'll be asking yourself as we go deeper. Was Ferdinand VII truly a king, or was he something far worse? Stay with me, because what happens next is even more disturbing than you might imagine. Let's rewind. Ferdinand was born in 1784, the eldest surviving son of King Charles IV of Spain and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma. Now, in theory, this should have been a boy destined for greatness, a child groomed to inherit one of the richest empires in the world. But from the very start, Ferdinand's life was poisoned by dysfunction. Court whispers spoke of corruption, scandals, and affairs. In fact, rumors swirled that Ferdinand's real father wasn't Charles IV at all, but Manuel de Godoy, his mother's powerful and manipulative favorite. Imagine growing up in a palace where even your parentage was uncertain, your legitimacy questioned. Ferdinand became insecure, bitter, and suspicious of everyone around him. If you're fascinated by these dark corners of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what comes next in Ferdinand's story will change the way you think about monarchy forever. While most future monarchs were educated in philosophy, governance, and diplomacy, Ferdinand's tutors drilled into him something else: a deep fear of losing power. He was taught to see conspiracies everywhere, to distrust advisors, and to cling desperately to his royal birthright. This was not the making of a leader, it was the making of a paranoid tyrant. And as Spain spiraled into chaos during the Napoleonic Wars, Ferdinand saw his chance to seize the throne. By the time he was in his 20s, Ferdinand had already earned himself a dark reputation: ambitious, manipulative, and ready to betray even his own father. Spain in the early 1800s was politically unstable. Napoleon Bonaparte loomed over Europe like a shadow, and Ferdinand's father, Charles IV, was increasingly viewed as weak and ineffective. Into this power vacuum stepped Godoy, the Queen's favourite, who many saw as the real ruler of Spain. Ferdinand hated him, not just because of the whispers about Godoy's affair with his mother, but because Ferdinand saw him as the obstacle between himself and the throne. So Ferdinand began plotting. In 1807, he conspired with aristocrats against his father and Godoy, secretly reaching out to none other than Napoleon for support. Yes, you heard that right. The future saviour of Spain willingly reached out to its greatest enemy. But here's the chilling part. Napoleon wasn't stupid. He saw Ferdinand for what he was, a pawn. And so, when the chance came in 1808, Napoleon invited both Charles IV and Ferdinand to Bayonne, under the pretense of mediation. What happened there would change Spain forever. Instead of gaining the crown, Ferdinand walked straight into a trap. Napoleon forced both him and his father to abdicate, handing the Spanish throne to his own brother Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand was humiliated, stripped of power, and imprisoned in France. For 6 long years, while Spaniards bled and starved resisting French occupation, Ferdinand sat in luxury captivity, waiting, watching, and scheming for his return. Now pause here and imagine this. You are a Spanish citizen during this time. You've lost brothers, fathers, and sons in the brutal guerrilla war against Napoleon's forces. You've seen your villages burned, your churches desecrated, your family hungry. And you believe, deep in your heart, that you are suffering for the rightful king, Ferdinand VII, who will one day return and save you. But what if I told you, the man you are waiting for is not your savior, but your destroyer? Napoleon is defeated. Spain is finally free. Across the country, the cry rises: "Viva Fernando VII! Long live King Ferdinand VII!" People line the streets, weeping, cheering, hailing him as a hero. They see him as the symbol of resistance, the rightful monarch who will restore honor and stability after years of horror. But the man who steps off that carriage is not a hero. He is a vengeful tyrant, ready to crush anyone who stood in his way. The Spanish people expect reform, they expect gratitude, they expect a king who has learned from exile. Instead, Ferdinand does something shocking. Within days of his return, he abolishes the Constitution of 1812, a liberal document created during the war, which promised freedom of the press, representative government, and basic rights for the people. Why? Because Ferdinand despised it. To him, liberty was nothing more than a threat to his power. With a stroke of his pen, he erased years of progress. He reinstated absolute monarchy, and he unleashed a wave of repression that would plunge Spain into darkness. Imagine the betrayal. After sacrificing everything in war, the people expected salvation, and instead they got chains. From 1814 onward, Ferdinand's reign became synonymous with cruelty. He censored newspapers, he banned political clubs, he unleashed secret police to spy on his own citizens. Thousands of liberals, intellectuals, and reformers were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. This wasn't about justice, it was about fear. Ferdinand saw enemies everywhere, students, writers, even priests who dared question him, and his paranoia only grew worse as he aged. But beyond the politics, beyond the tyranny, there was something even darker about Ferdinand. Accounts from the time describe him as sadistic, reveling in the suffering of others. He would smirk at the news of executions. He took pleasure in humiliating his opponents. One diplomat described him bluntly, a king without honor, without word, without pity. And yet, this is just the beginning. Because the story of Ferdinand VII isn't just about political oppression, it's about the way one man's depravity infected every corner of society, from his court to his marriages to the very bloodline of Spain. Stay with me, because in the next part we'll step deeper into Ferdinand's reign of terror. We'll uncover the betrayals, the scandals, and the shocking personal choices that earned him the title of history's most depraved king. But here's the chilling question to keep in mind. If a nation sacrifices everything for a king, what happens when that king is their greatest enemy? If you're fascinated by these dark corners of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what comes next in Ferdinand's story will change the way you think about monarchy forever. Imagine the mood in Spain in 1814. Villages destroyed, farms burned, families fractured after 6 years of war. Yet despite the pain, there was hope, because the people believed their suffering had meaning. They believed their loyalty to Ferdinand would be rewarded, but Ferdinand had other plans. The first sign came almost immediate. Eli, when he abolished the Constitution of 1812, that single act wasn't just political, it was personal. To Ferdinand, the Constitution represented betrayal. It had been written while he was locked away in France. To him, it symbolized Spain surviving without him. And for a man obsessed with power, nothing was more threatening than the idea that his people didn't need him. So what did he do? He crushed it. In one swoop, Ferdinand erased freedom of the press, dissolved the parliament known as the Cortes, and re-established absolute monarchy. But here's the chilling part. Ferdinand didn't stop there. Ferdinand unleashed what history remembers as the White Terror. Between 1814 and 1820, tens of thousands of Spaniards, intellectuals, writers, students, soldiers, were hunted down. Their crime? Supporting the Constitution or daring to criticize the king. Executions became routine. Public hangings turned into warnings. Families disappeared overnight, swallowed by prisons where torture was common. The Spanish Inquisition, which had been dying out, found new life under Ferdinand. Yes, you heard that right. The Inquisition, centuries old and nearly obsolete, was revived to silence dissent. Imagine living in that Spain. You whisper a complaint at the tavern, your neighbor reports you, and by morning you're chained in a dungeon. You print a pamphlet calling for reform. Your hands are broken so you'll never write again. This wasn't politics anymore. It was tyranny, pure and simple. And while his people suffered, Ferdinand indulged in luxury, surrounded by corrupt ministers who fed his paranoia and carried out his orders without question. But even as he tightened his grip on Spain, cracks began to form. In January 1820, soldiers in Cadiz, exhausted by repression and economic misery, rose in rebellion. They demanded the restoration of the Constitution of 1812. At first, Ferdinand mocked them. He thought the rebellion would collapse, but within weeks it spread across the country like wildfire. By March, Ferdinand was cornered. He had no choice but to accept the constitution he once despised. Standing before his people, he swore loyalty to the liberal charter. He even uttered the words, "Let us march frankly, and I the first, along the constitutional path." But here's the thing about Ferdinand, he never meant a word of it. For the next 3 years, during what's known as the Liberal Triennium, 1820-1823, he plotted in secret. While publicly pretending to follow the constitution, he secretly contacted European monarchs, begging them to help him crush the liberals. And in 1823, help arrived. In April 1823, a French army of 100,000 soldiers, nicknamed the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, marched into Spain. Their mission, restore Ferdinand's absolute power. The liberals tried to resist, but they were no match for the French. By October, the rebellion collapsed. Ferdinand was free, and once again, he revealed his true nature. If you're still with me, you're exactly the kind of viewer who loves uncovering the darkest corners of history. So before we move into the shocking scandals of Ferdinand's private life, take a moment to subscribe, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Instead of forgiveness, instead of compromise, Ferdinand unleashed a second wave of terror. Thousands of liberals were executed. Others fled into exile, leaving Spain brain-drained and bleeding. One Spanish writer described it perfectly. The king learns nothing and forgets nothing. Every lesson from history, every chance for mercy, ignored. Ferdinand chose vengeance every time. By now, Ferdinand's reign was infamous across Europe. Diplomats described him as deceitful, cowardly, and cruel. His own people began calling him El Rey Felon, the treacherous king. But to truly understand his depravity, we have to step inside his private life, because Ferdinand's personal choices were just as destructive as his political ones. Ferdinand married 4 times, 4 queens, 4 tragedies. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, died mysteriously in 1806. Whispers spread through the court that she had been poisoned, possibly with Ferdinand's knowledge. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, died in childbirth. His third wife, Maria Josepha of Saxony, was described as sickly and timid. She too died young. Finally, his fourth wife, Maria Christina of the 2 Sicilies, survived him. But their union was filled with political tension, as she fought to protect her daughter Isabella's right to inherit the throne against Ferdinand's scheming brothers. Here's the pattern. Ferdinand married for alliances, not love. And each time his obsession wasn't with his queens, but with producing an heir. Why? Because without a son, his dynasty's future was uncertain. This obsession would plunge Spain into one of its darkest conflicts, the Carlist Wars. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand was aging and sickly. He had no surviving sons. But in 1830, something remarkable happened. His wife, Maria Christina, gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. Ferdinand, desperate to secure her succession, issued the Pragmatic Sanction, which allowed his daughter to inherit the throne. This was revolutionary, because under the old Salic law, only males could inherit. But Ferdinand's brothers, led by Don Carlos, refused to accept this. They believed the throne should pass to them. And so when Ferdinand died in 1833, Spain was plunged into civil war. Liberals backed young Queen Isabella II, while conservatives rallied behind Don Carlos. The result? Decades of bloody conflict, the Carlist Wars, which tore Spain apart. Think about that for a moment. Ferdinand's selfish obsession with power didn't just ruin his own reign, it poisoned Spain for generations. So what made Ferdinand so uniquely destructive? Historians point to 3 traits. Paranoia, he trusted no one, he saw conspiracies everywhere and struck first, even against imaginary threats. Cruelty, he seemed to take pleasure in others' suffer. Treating executions and imprisonments as personal victories. Deceit, he lied constantly, swearing loyalty to constitutions, promising reforms, then betraying them the moment he had the chance. In short, he ruled not as a king, but as a tyrant. And yet, here's the disturbing truth. Ferdinand wasn't an isolated monster. He was part of a broader pattern of monarchs across Europe who clung to power as revolutions swept the continent. His depravity was extreme, but his story reflects a universal danger. What happens when leaders value control above all else? But here's where things get even darker. Because we've talked about Ferdinand's politics, we've talked about his betrayals, but what about his personal depravity? What about the rumors that haunted his court, the whispers of sadism, of grotesque pleasures, of a king who delighted in humiliation? Stay with me. In the next part, we'll go behind the palace walls. We'll explore the scandals that shocked even his closest allies, and reveal why Ferdinand VII remains to this day one of the most despised monarchs in history. But first, let me ask you, what happens when a man who fears love, fears trust, and fears his own people becomes king? If you're still with me, you're exactly the kind of viewer who loves uncovering the darkest corners of history. So before we move into the shocking scandals of Ferdinand's private life, take a moment to subscribe, because you won't want to miss what comes next. We've seen Ferdinand as a tyrant, we've seen him as a betrayer. But now let's step behind the palace walls, where the public eye rarely saw, because it's here, in the gilded chambers of Madrid's royal palace, that Ferdinand's depravity revealed itself most clearly. And what we find isn't just the story of a corrupt king, it's the story of a man so consumed by fear, lust, and cruelty that even his closest allies whispered about his grotesque habits. Contemporaries described Ferdinand as outwardly pious but inwardly vicious. He would attend mass, kiss relics, and bow to priests. But minutes later, he'd order a political prisoner tortured to death or laugh at the execution of an intellectual. He projected humility in public. In private, he was arrogant, mocking, and cruel. One diplomat wrote, "He smiles only when others weep. He forgives only when he can betray." It's this duplicity, this mask of devotion hiding a sadistic heart, that made Ferdinand's rule so chilling, and nowhere was this clearer than in his treatment of women. Let's return to Ferdinand's marriages. Maria Antonia of Naples, first wife. Intelligent and politically ambitious, she despised Ferdinand. Their marriage was marked by tension and resentment. When she died suddenly in 1806, many suspected poisoning. Was it natural illness, or had Ferdinand rid himself of a troublesome queen? The whispers never stopped. Maria Isabel of Portugal, second wife. She was gentle, modest, and devoted, but her death in childbirth revealed Ferdinand's obsession with heirs. Her passing barely paused his political games. Maria Josepha of Saxony, third wife. Sickly and timid, she endured years of isolation. Court gossip claimed Ferdinand ridiculed her behind closed doors. She died childless. Maria Christina of the Two Sicilies, fourth wife. She was young, more than 20 years his junior, and fiercely political. Unlike the others, she stood her ground. She fought to secure the throne for her daughter Isabella. But even with her, Ferdinand's paranoia poisoned the marriage. 4 wives, 4 tragedies, and not a single lasting partnership based on love. To Ferdinand, queens were tools, vessels for heirs, pieces on a chessboard of power, but his treatment of women went even further and darker. Throughout the 19th century, stories circulated about Ferdinand's personal life. They came from diplomats, courtiers, even servants. And while historians debate their accuracy, the sheer volume of these rumors paints a disturbing picture. One tale describes Ferdinand delighting in humiliating women at court, forcing them into degrading spectacles for his amusement. Another claims he indulged in grotesque fetishes, turning the palace into a stage for acts too scandalous to describe in detail. And then there were the whispers about his obsession with public punishment, how he enjoyed watching executions not just as justice but as entertainment. Now we need to be careful. Some of these accounts were exaggerated by his enemies, but the consistency of these stories, the repeated emphasis on his sadism, suggests a king whose personal pleasures aligned with his political cruelty. Imagine it, a monarch who ruled not just through fear, but through humiliation. Of course, Ferdinand wasn't alone. His court became a nest of corruption, filled with sycophants and opportunists who thrived under his rule. Bribery was rampant. Positions of power went not to the competent, but to the loyal and the flattering. Justice was sold to the highest bidder. Spain's economy, already shattered by war, sank deeper into chaos. Industry stagnated, trade collapsed. While ordinary Spaniards struggled to feed their families, Ferdinand and his favourites dined on extravagance. It's no wonder that one historian wrote, "Spain did not have a king, Spain had a parasite." And like a parasite, Ferdinand drained his country of life. Remember how in 1814 the crowds cheered, "Viva Fernando VII"? By the 1820s and 1830s, those cheers had turned to curses. To the liberals, he was a tyrant. To the conservatives, he was weak and corrupt. To the common people, he was simply hated. Imagine being a farmer, taxed to the bone while the king lavished money on his corrupt ministers. Imagine being a student, silenced for daring to dream of reform. Imagine being a soldier, fighting wars that served no purpose except to maintain Ferdinand's throne. And by the end of his reign, there were few left who truly believed in him. And yet, Ferdinand clung to power with every ounce of strength. As Ferdinand aged, his health declined. He grew obese, his face swollen, his body riddled with gout. His once commanding presence deteriorated into something pitiful. But even on his deathbed, he schemed. He obsessed over the succession, over the pragmatic sanction, over ensuring his daughter Isabella inherited the throne instead of his brother Don Carlos. It was almost tragic. This man who had betrayed everyone, who had destroyed his people's trust, now desperately clinging to the one thing he couldn't control, his legacy. When Ferdinand died in September 1833, Spain did not mourn. There were no tears in the streets, no heartfelt tributes. Instead, his death lit the fuse of civil war. The Carlist Wars weren't just about succession. They were about ideology. Liberals supported Isabella, conservatives supported Don Carlos, and Spain descended into decades of bloodshed. This was Ferdinand's final gift to his country: division, chaos, and suffering. So how should we remember Ferdinand VII? Historians call him El Rey Felon, the treacherous king. He betrayed his father, his allies, his people, and even his own promises. He crushed Spain's chance at modernization, dragging it back into tyranny. He left his nation weaker, poorer, and more divided than he found it. But beyond the politics, beyond the wars, there's a deeper lesson here. Ferdinand wasn't just a bad king, he was a mirror, reflecting the dangers of unchecked power. When leaders see themselves as above the law, when they mistake loyalty for obedience, when cruelty becomes entertainment, they don't just destroy themselves, they destroy nations. And Ferdinand VII hath proved that in the most devastating way possible. But wait, there's one last twist. Because while Ferdinand is remembered as Spain's most depraved king, his death didn't end the story. His choices shaped the destiny of Spain for generations. The wars, the stability, even the monarchy's struggle to survive into the modern age, all of it traces back to him. So stay with me. In the final part, we'll pull back and ask the big questions. What does Ferdinand's story teach us about power, about corruption, and about the dangers of blind loyalty? And why does his shadow still linger over Spain today? But let me leave you with this thought. If a king can betray his people, what does that say about the system that allowed him to rule at all? If you've made it this far, you're clearly fascinated by the darkest corners of history. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell, because the conclusion to Ferdinand's story isn't just history, it's a warning. September 29th, 1833. The bells of Madrid toll. King Ferdinand VII is dead, and yet, instead of uniting a grieving nation, his death tears Spain apart. Streets erupt with rumours, soldiers whisper in barracks, families argue at dinner tables. Should the crown pass to his young daughter Isabella, barely 3 years old, or to his brother Don Carlos, who claims the throne under the ancient law of male succession? The answer ignites civil war, the First Carlist War, a bloody conflict that would rage for years and cost countless lives. Ferdinand was gone, but his poison remained. Let's pause here and reflect. Most kings are remembered for what they build: cathedrals, reforms, victories. Ferdinand VII, he's remembered for what he destroyed. He destroyed trust between monarch and people. He destroyed Spain's chance at liberal reform. He destroyed the stability of succession by forcing through the pragmatic sanction. And in doing so, he set Spain on a course of decades of instability, a cycle of wars, coups, and revolutions that haunted the 19th century. Think about it. Even as late as the Spanish Civil War in the 20th century, echoes of Ferdinand's divisions still lingered, his refusal to compromise. His obsession with control, his betrayal of liberal hopes, all of it created a culture of mistrust and polarization that never truly healed. So how do historians judge Ferdinand VII today? The verdict is almost unanimous. He was one of Spain's worst monarchs, perhaps the worst. Why? Because unlike kings who simply failed through incompetence, Ferdinand actively made Spain weaker. His choices weren't just poor, they were malicious. One historian described him as a king who reigned not to serve his country but to serve himself. Others go further, calling him sadistic, treacherous and cowardly. Even his own people had little good to say. Remember his nickname? El Rey Felon, the treacherous king. That name has stuck for nearly 2 centuries. It's rare in history for a monarch to be remembered almost universally with contempt. Ferdinand managed it. Now let's step out of the 19th century for a moment, because Ferdinand's story isn't just dusty history, it's a warning. Think about it. How many leaders, even today, cling to power by silencing critics? How many dismantle constitutions, control the press, or rewrite the rules to secure their legacy? How many promise reform, only to betray it the moment it threatens their authority? Ferdinand's Spain may feel distant, but the pattern is familiar. Absolute power, fear of change, a ruler who sees compromise not as strength but as weakness. And here's the chilling truth. Societies that place blind trust in leaders, without checks, without accountability, are always vulnerable to another Ferdinand. It doesn't matter whether it's a king in the 1800s or a politician today. When loyalty outweighs truth, when obedience outweighs justice, when fear replaces freedom, history repeats itself. But let's not forget the real victims here. Behind every political act, every decree, every betrayal, there were ordinary Spaniards, farmers whose crops were taxed into ruin, soldiers forced to fight in wars they didn't believe in, writers silenced for daring to dream of a freer Spain, women widowed, children orphaned, families broken. Ferdinand VII didn't just ruin Spain politically, he ruined lives. And perhaps that's the darkest truth of all, that a single man's lust for power could cause suffering on such a massive scale. So picture it again. Madrid, 1833. A king's coffin carried through the streets. No tears, no love, just silence, whispers and relief. Ferdinand VII believed he was eternal. He believed he could control Spain forever. But in the end, all he left was a shattered kingdom, a civil war, and a name that history would spit out with contempt. And maybe that's the lesson here. Power built on fear never lasts. Power built on betrayal never inspires. Power built on cruelty never survives. So the next time you hear the phrase absolute power, remember Ferdinand VII, the king who ruled through treachery, cruelty, and lies. Ask yourself, if one man could drag an entire empire into darkness, what would stop it from happening again? And more importantly, would we recognize it before it's too late? If this story made you pause and think, then you're exactly the kind of person who belongs here. On this channel, we uncover the forgotten, the disturbing, and the chilling truths of history that still matter today. So if you want more dark stories like this, make sure to subscribe, tap the bell, and share this video with someone who thinks history is just kings and dates. Because as Ferdinand VII proves, history is about power, corruption, and survival, and the lessons we can't afford to forget.